Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here at the North Texas chapter of ISSA Cybersecurity Conference. I have the pleasure of introducing Patrick Hayes, who is a certified enterprise security architect and QSA. Patrick is a business leader with over 20 years of experience in information technology strategy. He operated in several key senior technology and operation roles, accounting for strategic direction, organizational alignment, and execution. Recently served as Chief Information Officer for IC Group, Managing Director for AT&T Canada's Consulting Services, and now Patrick's responsible for the U.S. operations of Securus, a leading information security consulting and managed services firm. This afternoon, Patrick will be presenting Trust Modeling for Cloud Outsourcing. If I may have everybody welcome Patrick Hayes. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. As soon as you can't, let me know, because I like to walk around a little bit, and they told me I need to kind of stick around here, so I'll do my best. Why don't I start by saying, how many folks in the room here know what cloud services are? How many folks in the room have cloud services in their organization? How many folks here were consulted before cloud services were subscribed to? Yeah. Okay. So I've been involved with, around cloud services, ASP services, outsourced services, or whatever, however you'd like to call it, for a large portion of my career. And what I wanted to share with you today is some of the things that I've learned from the security world that I wish I knew back when I was actually in my outsourcing world, when I was actually hosting, managing, running services for my clients, or looking for those services myself. For those that are not familiar, I pulled this definition from the most legitimate source on the internet, Wikipedia, but it did seem reasonable. So what I did want to do is just from a baseline perspective, just say cloud services means services available to users on demand via the internet from cloud computing environment servers that are not on your own premises. That doesn't necessarily mean that your services are where you think you are, or you think they are. And when I say that, what I mean is I was working with one client, a very large beverage company, whose marketing department moved all of their strategic marketing information to Google Docs and to Google. I said, this is really great. What a fantastic collaboration platform. And when I started my project with them, they said, oh, just here's your invite to our Google space. Go and pull down the information that you need. And so I was concerned about that, because they were actually a very large beverage bottling company. And I had a pretty good relationship with their chief marketing officer, and I said, do you realize that all of this wonderful strategic information that you put up, because this is a great collaborative platform, because of the user agreement, is now their property? And he said, no, I did not. And I said, well, when you were going through the evaluation of whether you were going to host a collaboration platform in the house or go external, was that ever a part of the consideration that you made? He said, no, it was not. It was just cost and availability. And as a matter of fact, we discovered that they didn't even go through a real process of looking at what was going to solve their problem versus what was going to fit within the guidelines and the standards of their organization. So when I say that you don't even know where the services are, it took months and months and months, finally. And were they ever deleted from Google servers, that were replicated from one to the next? But the request went in, please take all our stuff off of your servers, and please delete all our stuff and all the rest of that. But there's still no guarantee that any of that went away, because, as you know, it can get replicated from one to another to another to another. So now that I kind of set a baseline around, cloud services and maybe a past experience that I've had, I really wanted to talk about the concept of trust before I get into how would you approach trust modeling for cloud, and really what trust modeling is. And I'll say that trust is based, in the business world at least, is based on a business relationship. There needs to be a business relationship in place. It's a necessary precursor to an interaction, right? Unless, of course, you do believe those emails that you get from the Nigerian prince, and you do actually share your banking information, based on that level of trust. But ideally, there's some level of trust in terms of a business relationship. Finally, assurance is required in order to maintain and facilitate positive trust. Now, I used to work with this fellow who was a leadership coach in my past, and he was a very, very good one, very effective one. And he had a really great saying, because he found that most of his executives that he was coaching said, I really want to build trust with my team. And he said, you already have trust with your team. He says it just depends on whether you have established negative trust or positive trust, because they're going to trust you to do something. Whether it's going to be a bad outcome or a positive outcome, you've already established trust. So trust in this instance is you really want to have some sort of positive trust. In the world of business, there are a number of things that you can do. There's a number of mechanisms that can help you establish that trust or that level of trust. And then there's different levels of assurance that's required based on the level of relationships that you have. Like, you may have one vendor where all you're doing is you're outsourcing a very small component of your business, or you have another partner that has access control to production systems because they are very specialized in their skills, and the level of trust that needs to exist there, it needs to be of a different level. So, in establishing kind of the baseline of what trust is. So from entity A to entity B, there's a one-way trust. Entity B, you could establish a two-way trust. So if I'm buying something from you, then I have a trust, then I'm establishing trust that I'm going to give you money, you're going to give me products or services or goods, and there's some level of trust there. On your side, there's an established trust that I'm going to provide you with money, and my funds are going to go through, and I'm not going to stiff you on whatever I'm buying from you, in the very rudimentary form. Now, that can get extended by, say, entity C. So if you're a restaurant, and I'm a patron of your restaurant, I'm a customer of your restaurant, I come in and I buy something, or I buy lunch from you, there's a level of trust. I'm going to order what I've ordered off the menu. I trust that I'm going to get a fairly good representation of what I'm going to get off the menu served to me. And there's a high degree of trust that I'm not going to stiff you on it and walk out. Similarly, if you're getting your food from a third-party provider that's dropping it off, there's a level of trust that the shrimp that I just had for lunch, that you served me, is going to be good. It's not going to give me salmonella or things like that. So there's a transitive trust that then starts to build here. And the point that I'm making here is that, when you're thinking about services that are established by groups within your organization, in isolation, sometimes your marketing groups, sometimes a business unit, things like that, sometimes this is lost, right? The whole thought of transitive trust and somebody allowing trust within your organization that they may or may not have authority to do. What I'm trying to establish here is that the baseline of trust can be extended from one entity to another entity without your organization even being aware that there was transitive trust that was being created. Because it gets complicated, right? Who's the relying or the trusting entity, and who's the claimant? Who's the trusted entity in this? Would entity A, if I'm a if I'm at your restaurant and you serve me bad shrimp, would I connect that to entity C, who was the one that supplied the shrimp to you? Or would I just connect it to you? But there's some level of trust that where you're getting your supplies from are not going to make me sick. So, now I'll take it and distill it down into really basic. When you're buying a hot dog, pretty basic. You're going to get a hot dog, you're going to pay for the hot dog, you're going to assume the hot dog is good, you're going to eat it, that person's going to take the money, and it's a pretty basic interaction. When you buy a house, however, and I've had the good pleasure of buying a house down here in Texas, which is, as you can tell by my accent, is a very different experience than buying a house in a place like Canada. It's very complicated, actually, down here. Anybody who's never been in Canada, it's a pretty easy process to buy a house up there. Down here, it gets pretty complicated with titles and the rest of it, right? So the level of complication is just far greater, and there's a far greater amount of transitive trust that exists within there. Like, for me to provide a whole bunch of financial information to these third parties and have no guarantee that some of my financial information wasn't being provided to their third parties as they were going through and doing credit checks and allowing me to have an offer letter and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden I'm getting contacted by people that were going to underwrite my title, and I have no end, even 2 years later, I have no end to people that are contacting me to sell me stuff based on me buying a house here. And the experience was very, very, very different when I was in Canada. So, in any event, what I'm trying to establish here is that when you're thinking about trust, and when you're thinking about this, in a business environment, when you're thinking about outsourcing services within your organization or looking for more cost-effective mechanisms, sometimes common sense doesn't necessarily come into play. And as you can see, it gets pretty complicated when you're talking about a business. When I was in the telecommunications world, I must have had 65 suppliers at any given time for my infrastructure. And we had partners because we were responsible for retail, we were responsible for business, and we were responsible for wholesale. And so, how critical was each of these relationships to us? Yeah, you have some product vendors that are really critical to your supply chain. You have some third parties that were ISPs out in the marketplace that were an extension of your fiber into those markets that you weren't in. But again, what mechanisms did you have to evaluate just how important they were to you and your organization? So how does this relate to cloud, right? Talk about cloud because cloud's cool. What I'm saying here is that in order for you to understand the level of risk that your organization is taking on as a business, cloud is another extension of trust that you need to evaluate as a part of your risk tolerance. If you're going to outsource your office, 365 and desktop and all the rest of that stuff, well, you might think that that's pretty straightforward and easy and basic, and look at your SLAs. But what happens if, what happens if the service goes down? Well, so who's accountable for that? Well, your cloud provider is accountable for that. Well, but what happens if it's down for 3 days? Then who's accountable for that? Who's really the authority that is responsible for managing that? Now, what happens if not only was it down, but it was down because somebody had replicated all your data and taken it, and now you've had a breach? Pardon me, an incident. It's not a breach until it's really a breach, right? But who's accountable for that? And was that person who's really accountable, the authority for that service, right? Were they consulted in the process? Were they a part of that decision? And was that acceptable risk for the business to take on? Sure, it was acceptable cost-cutting measures because it reduced your licensing with your Microsoft vendor or with whoever your service vendor was for that. But did it actually reduce, or did it create more risk for your organization? Or if it did actually create risk for your organization, was it evaluated, and did you actually have the opportunity to say, yeah, that's acceptable, we're okay with that, and we're okay if this thing goes down for 2-3 days. And by the way, we have these contingencies in place for scenarios like that. What I find often is that there isn't, and I can tell you from experience. So as early back as 1999, I built this really, really cool e-commerce platform, right? It wasn't called cloud back then, but basically I had a software platform that was basically a virtual inventory management system. It was really cool because basically all these online merchants that had multiple storefronts, either their own hosted storefronts or whether they were in Yahoo or Miva or wherever they were, they would use my back-end inventory management system, and that would connect to all these supply houses like Ingram and the rest of it. And then we did something really cool. On top of that, we integrated all this marketing data that came from a third-party source. And, so it was great. And it worked 95% of the time. And when it didn't work, it was either from something that came across from one of the suppliers, an infection of some sort that came across from the supplier. More importantly, it actually most often came from the supplier of our marketing data. So you take a product that was in inventory, and then it had a SKU, and that SKU was then coordinated with the marketing information of that SKU within the third-party marketing data. Well, oftentimes it was corrupted. And so it would take down that merchant's entire inventory system, killing 1 to 6 to 7 to 8 stores at a time. And it took us forever to figure out what the source of the problem was. Now, I was the service provider. And you got to imagine that we were all running around like chickens with our heads cut off trying to make sure this thing is all together, it's all working, all the rest of it. Just imagine if you were the merchant and your stores that were generating 30% of your income at that point in time are suddenly all down for 1 or 2 or 3 days. And your service provider can't figure out what the problem is. So now amplify that by, we knew where all of our services were. Fast forward that 10 years, when we started using cloud services and AWS and the rest of it, finding the source was even more difficult at that point. So the components of risk. So when I started looking at doing this model again, I left, I went to AT&T, and I learned a whole bunch of things from that environment on best practices and all the things that you want to do right. And then I went back into my own venture again, and we were doing loyalty management services, loyalty management systems. As a matter of fact, we hosted probably one of the most recognizable systems in North America with, we'll say, with one of the diaper companies out there. I won't name the names. But when we went and we explored that, we sat down with that team. We said, okay, so instead of us just looking at the technology we're providing to you, what we want to understand is the assets that come along with that, right? Because we're taking on customer data at this point. We've got financial data. We've got other data that is related to your supply chain. And so we want to make sure that you as a client, you understand that there's a business impact for these things, and we want to make sure that there's a good understanding of what you're outsourcing, right? Well, so we were working with the marketing organization, and the marketing department said, oh, does that mean we need to bring IT into this? We said, yeah, you need to bring IT into this because we're going to be hosting all of your customer data. They said, well, can't you just replicate our customer data on a daily basis? Just do a database synchronization and pull it all across. They said, well, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. I'm not sure you should feel really comfortable doing that. And, what the point I'm trying to make here is decisions were being made in the room that individuals had no authority to make decisions over, quite frankly. There was information that could have been placed at risk that didn't have the right level of authority reviewing the risk that was moving out into that service. Now, was it a great service? Absolutely. Was it? Did it deliver what the client has asked us for in the service requirements? Did we have SLAs in place? Absolutely. But when the service went down, who on their side was accountable for it? Who on our side? I know who on our side was accountable for it, and I knew what my SLAs said. Actually, none of my SLAs, and I say this now because I'm not there anymore, none of my SLAs had any mention of loss of client data. None of my SLAs had any mention of breach. There was one mention of breach, pardon me, in the area of loss of points, but it was one-sided from our perspective. So we said that if anybody was to fraudulently obtain points, we reserve the right to remove those points and actually prosecute that fraudulent user. But was that protecting our client or was that protecting us? Well, that was protecting us. If the financial impact to our client, though, because we did have a breach, we did have somebody that took out 1 million points of our loyalty program, and you think, okay, well, it's loyalty points. It's not worth anything, but they were cashed in for prizes. Oh, yeah, okay, but we caught it, and we caught it before the prizes were awarded, so there's still no financial impact. Well, actually, in the world of promotional marketing, if you actually take a prize out because it was won, whether fraudulently or not, the prize cannot be reseeded back in, cannot be put back into the contest again. It's not like you can say, ooh, we had 499, oh, but we have an extra one, we'll throw that back in, because all of those things need to be predetermined at the point in time that the contest is started. So having an extra warehouse full of prizes like bicycles and books and other things, it wasn't helpful for our client, and it cost them money because it actually came out of their budget. It didn't come out of my budget, it came out of their budget because we still charged them for it. And it's not like we were going to run a contest later in the year for 2 bicycles. I guess we could have, but it probably would have cost them more money than it would have to give away the $200 bicycles. What I'm saying is that the entire service level agreement was one-sided, and it was one-sided to us, with the exception of accessibility and availability. The program will be available, the program will be accessible, so your downtime will be minimized, and you'll be always available to our clients. Meaning, if somebody signs in and and their username and password is not accepted, you need to be able to handle that. If somebody signs in and if you're down, you need to be able to be available for that. If somebody signs in and steals a whole bunch of user data because they find a way to cross-site script, there was no SLA around that. That was good for me, right? Good for my company, because I only needed to be accountable for things that we needed to have in place for my company. But that didn't necessarily appropriately account for my clients, and this is not a negative story. We actually did put a lot of contingencies in place specifically for that reason. However, the point I'm trying to make is this was a service that could have been completely developed in-house, could have been completely delivered in-house. They had their own CRM system. They had the capability of doing this. They chose to move to our service. Our service was completely hosted. The majority of it sat out in web services, and so much of their risk was not accounted for in that. They didn't even invite IT to the table until we asked them, we need IT at the table because we're talking about identity access management across multiple realms. And they didn't want to have their users having different usernames and passwords for their environment. They wanted to have the same one across all of the services. So for anybody that's been on the security or the IT services side of the business and watching marketing or business users or business units or whatnot looking at outsourcing services or subscribing to services or things like that, I understand your frustration. And I understand that it would be a lot easier if they just talk to you sooner. And there's ways of doing that. There's ways of actually engaging in that. And it's all around changing the conversation from threats to risk. So traditionally, right, when we get involved, when we're engaged, it's to talk about those vulnerabilities and the threats out there. Oh, well, okay, so now I've got a heightened awareness that whether it's an internal service or an external service, if I put it up in the cloud, is it going to be vulnerable, right? Can it get hacked? And is there any threats up there? So if I put it in Amazon Web Services, is there a risk that the data is going to get lost? Well, there's always a risk the data is going to get lost, right? It just really depends on what contingencies are in place and what controls are in place. But when you're outsourcing a business process, you're not outsourcing your controls with it, are you? Well, you should be, right? So the same level of controls that you would have to have in-house for yourself, you'd still need to have if you outsource it and if you put it in a cloud service. I was talking to a client the other day, and they were saying, well, we want to move most of our PCI cardholder data into AWS. And their PCI guy, like their internal ISA, was like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that, because I don't need to have all of that in scope into our PCI environment, because he understood the benefit of the controls that you can enforce in place and how difficult it is when you're looking at that. Now, we're not talking about outsourcing transaction management, outsourcing the payment processing and the rest of it, although that's changed slightly now too. But what tends to be missing in all of this is the business context, right? The business context for why you would want to do this, as well as the threat and vulnerability information, so that you can select the appropriate controls to work with your vendor on. And I know that in a lot of cases, it's like, no, you're going to subscribe to Office 365, you just get whatever that service level agreement is. Well, is it appropriate for your organization? It might be. It might be a low-risk service. And whoever the authority for that capability within your environment is, they may be completely comfortable with you taking on that risk for the organization. Another useful tool that I find in this scenario is, we're not just talking about, say, technically outsourcing a service, you're also talking about outsourcing the risk around that service, right? And so when you look at that, it's the operational criticality and the information sensitivity, right? Another way to look at it is the severity of the risk that exists, or the severity of the situation that exists, right, versus the likelihood of it happening. So when you're looking at outsourcing certain services like your email, maybe the operational criticality is medium. But maybe the information sensitivity is low, because maybe it's just all of the salespeople that are just using that service, right? You're going to extend your CRM system to the web client or to the mobile client, but only 10 people are going to be on it, and the sensitivity of the data, they're not going to be able to pull across contracts or anything like that. All they're going to be able to do is view. Or maybe they'll be able to edit, but they won't be able to import or anything like that. At the end of the day, it really comes down to understanding the risk around what it is that you're extending to that environment, and then applying the appropriate controls. And it gets more difficult when you're not in control of that service out there. So let's take it in the context of, say, like a healthcare organization. From a grand scheme of things, right, that healthcare organization has sort of like a super domain, right? A domain that is responsible for all of the governance, risk, and compliance of that organization. Within that, you might have sub-domains, right? Like a regional health center, and within that, there might be, IT, or there might be marketing, or there might be patient services. You'll have your suppliers in that, right? So some suppliers will sit across that, and then others will be completely external to that. The healthcare organization, well, they're a for-profit business most of the time, right? In this scenario, not in Canada, but in this scenario, most of the time they're a for-profit. They provide patient care, clinical research, facilities management, community outreach in some cases, right? Some of the regulation that they need to be aware of and responsible for, HIPAA, high-tech, FSMA, if they do any research. Right? So there's a pre-existing business model, and there's some pre-existing regulatory compliance that exists in there. Let's look at it in the context of a cloud services provider. They're also a for-profit business. And of course, nowadays, it's a really great for-profit business. They do application hosting. They have applications as a service, payment processing, data management, you name it. If it could be put in the cloud, it'll get put in the cloud, and if somebody will subscribe to it, somebody will subscribe to it. And not often, not for everything, but, in most cases it will be. But you see where I'm going here. They may have regulatory compliance issues because it's enforced upon them. So if they do credit card processing as a supplier, if they host it, if there's any cardholder data in their environment, they need to be responsible for PCI DSS. Or maybe they have their own ISO standards that they follow. Or maybe they follow NIST, or maybe they have HIPAA. What I'm saying, when you're looking at outsourcing certain components of your services, right, whether it's credit card processing or whether it's patient file management, right? I subscribe to this really cool patient management system in the cloud. Well, it's a lower cost. I get higher processing capacity because, we got really high volumes, and doing it in-house is really killing our bandwidth, and we'd have to update our systems and all the rest of it. The expertise is there because now I don't have to manage the servers and all the rest of that because it's all a part of the service now. And I got SLAs, right? They're going to give me uptime and accessibility. And they have some words about HIPAA and about PCI DSS in their SLA, right? But now, however, with PCI DSS 3.0, they actually have to provide you attestation, which is good, finally. Liability. Here's my favorite, because I've often had clients say, well, if I outsource my threat management, I'm kind of outsourcing the liability around that too, right? Well, yeah, but if you were to actually read your service provider's contract, it would say they're limited to the liability of the value of the contract, because their lawyers told them to say that, because it's responsible. And then they've got errors and omission insurance, and they may even have additional insurance on top of that if there was an incident and you chose to sue them. They still will have some insurance defaults there to back up on. But largely, you're holding the bag. If you have a major breach, if you have a major incident, if you have a compromise of your services in the cloud based on the risk and the severity and the importance of the data that you have there, you are holding the bag, not your service provider. They may be standing right beside you to a limited liability, but they're not going the last mile with you, because you're still accountable. Looking at that from a different perspective, so is your risk addressed? I can tell you not often. And, I'm really sorry that it took a really long, boring path to get here, but what I find often is that when an organization looks to outsource a service or looks at a cloud service or is already in the process of pushing something to a cloud service, often the business users haven't gone through a risk exercise when they look at that. Or if IT does it, sometimes the business isn't involved. It takes both parties, right? Threat and vulnerabilities and risks are different things, right? A vulnerability is a vulnerability, and it's a technical thing that, based on its severity and its likelihood of happening, needs to be patched or doesn't need to be patched. You don't make a decision to patch a vulnerability if you've got 200 vulnerabilities in your environment. I can guarantee you that no one's going to run out and patch all 200 of them over the next couple of days, because it's not all that easy. You've got to prioritize it somehow. Well, how do you prioritize it? You prioritize it based on the severity of the vulnerability and the likelihood of it happening, which is really kind of a risk view of it, right? You say, well, what's going to present the greatest degree of risk to this organization? And I'm going to go out and I'm going to patch my vulnerabilities based on that. But vulnerabilities and threats are not risk. Risk is what you accept or what you don't accept. And the severity of that risk really depends on what data you have on the other side of it. Had a really great reminder over lunch over that, actually. A fellow sitting beside me was talking all about risk. Very enjoyable conversation. Accountability. Well, so with your service providers, the accountability stops at the SLA. Plain and simple. Right? There might be some degree of push, right? I was working with an outsourced service provider because I didn't have the computing capacity to manage a loyalty program with 6 million users on it. So I had to use a provider. I wasn't going to become a data center in order to do that. However, when my service provider had an outage for 2 days, was my service provider accountable to my customer? No. And it would have been unacceptable for me to go and talk to my customer saying that was an outage with my service provider. They don't care. I was accountable for it. Ultimately, they were accountable for it. When their users couldn't get into the system, into the service, they were accountable for it. The users didn't care if they got the service from me, and if I bought the service from somebody else, they were accountable for it. If there was a breach in the service, and let's say that 1 million users' information was leaked, and somebody got in there and downloaded all the user profiles, would they have said, oh yeah, that company that such and such a company works with, they let it happen? Well, the media would have found it out and made sure that the world knew, but they still would have held that company accountable for it. Not necessarily us. We probably would have been out of business anyways, but they would have still been held accountable for it. So the impact to them was far larger than potentially what it was to me. I guess, again, I could be out of business from that, right? Control enforcement. Never once, I can tell you this, never once did I ever have a controls conversation with any of my clients. I can tell you that when I did actually outsource services, however, I absolutely had control conversations with them. What controls do you have in place? Physical, logical controls do you have in place for these scenarios? Because these scenarios are important to my organization, because they have a likelihood of increasing the risk that we have associated with our services. It's not as easy as just going online and subscribing to a service, putting in your credit card, and suddenly all of a sudden you now have this capability. It goes beyond that. It really does. I mean, you have to think of the sensitivity of the data that you have in there and the likelihood of your service provider having the controls that you need in place to safeguard that data. Disclosure. I worked in a scenario where I had a service provider, and this is when I was in my telecommunications life. They had several months of breaches going on related to my service that were never disclosed to us. Is that ethical? Did they have to? We never told them that they had to. We didn't write it into the SLAs that they had to. They had no obligation to tell us that they had incidents, which were really breaches, which put our information at risk, because we also had a responsibility to disclose as well. So if we don't have our service provider disclosing to us, how are we going to appropriately handle that? Should we have disclosed? Was it really an incident? How do we treat it? So when you're thinking about that, are these cloud service providers responsible for disclosing to you incidents that happen within their environment? Often they're not. Why should they? Oh, well, we had a breach on these servers. It wasn't related to your servers at all, but they were all within the same infrastructure. But, we had zones. You're okay. But maybe in some instances, you need to have that disclosure. Finally, liability. I talked about this before. So if my company goes out of business because my service provider, decides that they're going to unplug their servers for 3 days, and I can no longer provide the service that I'm providing to my customer because I'm buying it from the cloud, are they liable for me going out of business? No, they're just liable for how much I paid them. So you got to think about that. If there's a breach as a result of somebody jumping across from one area to the other area in their environment, or an internal staff member or what have you, how far does it go? I was working with one organization that there was a fellow that was working there in their IT group, and they decommissioned a couple of servers. He said, wow, this is awesome. I'm going to take these home. I'm going to use them at home. And, you know, it was from a financial management company. It happened to have thousands and thousands and thousands of customer records on them. I mean, he wiped them clean and he just recommissioned them as servers for himself. He figured, well, you know what? They were just going to throw them out anyways. Did the company ever disclose that liability to their customer? Well, in that instance, they had to. But does that stuff happen all the time? I can tell you it does because I've actually seen it. I've seen it happen. Is that worthy of disclosure? Who's got the liability there, right? What happens if all of a sudden all this information starts leaking out? And in any event, what I'm saying is the controls that you have in your business should not stop at your perimeter, should not stop at the services that you host within your company. They should absolutely be extended to your service providers, to the things that you're moving into the cloud. And your organization needs to be educated and aware of the fact that risk exists, and you have controls and policies in place for a reason. And just like, we were having conversations 10 years ago around secure software coding and why it's good to have secure coding for web applications so that you don't have, cross-site scripting and other, malicious behavior going on in your websites getting to your back-end databases and whatnot. It's the same thing. The same education cycle needs to be there. You need to be able to not just view it as, we have light in this room, and today TXU is providing the light, and tomorrow Reliant might provide the light. It's not as easy as that. You're outsourcing a business service. You're outsourcing something that is impactful to your business. And so you need to understand the risks associated with that. And sometimes it takes a greater degree of review before you do things like that. Again, I always like to look at it from a Heatmap perspective. If it's something that's going to have, a high degree of criticality and a high degree of information sensitivity, I don't want to do this in isolation. I don't want to do this on my own. I want to make sure that the stakeholders are involved, that I'm not just making an isolated decision, or that a decision is being made in isolation that doesn't involve those folks that are actually accountable for something going very poorly. Because the problem is it actually will. So, a good friend of mine, I don't know if he's in the room today, I don't think so, but he wrote an article just shortly ago, and I thought it summed it up really quite well. Contracts and service level agreements. You absolutely need to make sure that you specify any regulatory or industry security standards you expect your vendor to follow. Will all of them agree to you and follow them? Yeah, maybe not. Maybe they have lots of clout and they won't. But if you don't, at least you see the gaps. You can make plans for the gaps. Those are called contingencies, right? If you don't know what you don't know, then yeah, it's going to happen to you. And, I'd rather not have surprises. I'd rather know what the gaps are ahead of time. Specify who's responsible to make sure the service is protected with the right security controls. So if security controls need to be enforced, put it in your contracts. Don't just look at the service level agreements as they relate to liability and as they relate to service uptime and as it relates to service charges and things like that. Actually look for these types of or put these terms in place. Specify how the controls will be validated and remedies if they're not. Right? So how often does your service provider do vulnerability assessments? Are they accountable for doing penetration testing on the systems that you're hosting your services on? Do they provide you with reports on that? Well, they'll say, maybe we don't have to. You can say, well, maybe I don't need to give you my services either. It's up to you, right? It's still your decision. You could still choose to go with it. It's your, that's the nice thing about risk. You can choose what your risk tolerance is. Sometimes industry regulations choose for you. But you can choose what your risk tolerance is. And if you're okay with the gaps that exist, that's fine. But at least you've made a conscious, educated decision, right? right, about what those gaps might be. Finally, specify what happens in the event of a security breach or an incident. Do they need to disclose to you? Are they obligated to disclose to you? If you feel that they should be, well, ask for that. If you don't believe that, you're going to get that, or if they tell you no, again, it's a decision you can make based on the level of risk that you believe. At least you're going to now have the conversation around it, and they'll have to provide you with some reasoning as to why not. Will AWS do this with you? They may not. At the same time, they may have a much more comprehensive service agreement than other service providers. Absolutely, if you're looking at a small cloud service provider, you absolutely need to talk about these things. They need to be in place. Because that's a lot of risk you're putting your company at, believe it or not, right? Depending on what data you put there, I guess. Again, the basis of trust. We don't I know this is Texas, and I know that we're all, gentlemen and cordial people here. We do business on a handshake sometimes still like we used to, but it's not like that anymore. Not when your stuff can be hosted out in Asia Pacific or in Ireland or wherever the server farm might be, right? Virtualized and pushed across wherever. You still have mechanisms in place to manage that. I've been given the red card. I want to make sure that I have enough time for maybe one or two questions, and if you have any. Yes?
I have a question. You covered it but in the previous life, I worked for a company, one of the SLAs, we had to go in, somebody from our company had the right to go in and audit the company that we were outsourcing to. They go in there and they look for PCI compliance shows.
Yeah.
We do PII, and when you go as far as like a DR plan or a business continuity plan, have you experienced any whether the majority of people you're familiar with, companies you're familiar with doing that, or is that just something that you decide as a company when you outsource to people?
So I can talk from two perspectives of that. So as being responsible for IT infrastructure and and all of it, right? I looked for service providers that would provide me some level of assurance for what was going on in their facilities. A lot harder to do with cloud services, right? Because we're talking about virtualized services that could be pretty much anywhere. What I was looking for is documentation from them around controls and a validation of what they had in place that would satisfy me. As a service provider myself, in two separate instances, I used to host services for Amex. That was the most maturing situation in my life because they asked me everything. They sent people down and they assessed because I wanted that business. My maturity level went from this to that after my first assessment with those guys. And then my expectations, both as a owner and of IT infrastructure and as a service provider later, were shaped around that. It's a little harder to do with some cloud service providers, right? But yeah, absolutely. I would say, some regulatory compliance asks for you, or does that for you, like PCI 3.0 now, or 3.1, actually now says your outsourced service provider needs to give you an attestation. Thank you, finally, right? As opposed to just saying, yeah, we're good. But others don't, right? So I would just say, if you have controls within your environment that need to be in place for your services, those controls extend to your third parties, to your cloud service providers, and I would just try to look for evidence of those and write them into your contracts, if you can. Or if you don't, at least understand the risk that you're taking as a result of that, and have some contingency plan in place for it. I think I might have time for one more. Do I? Okay. Yes?
What is your definition of breach? And maybe more importantly, when you're negotiating these agreements breach, because that's a pretty slippery
It is.
notion. Is a breach, or is it a breach? Or is it an incident? Or what level does it have to rise to? I mean, you see where I'm going.
Yeah.
And lawyers love definitions, and most of us don't want to deal with it.
Well, I'll tell you, so lawyers don't want you to, at least your own lawyers, don't want you to use the word breach until you have to use the word breach, because it implicates you and it creates liability for you. I don't think I have a perfect definition of what's a breach and what's an incident, except for it's an incident when something occurs and you know that there's been malicious activity. It then becomes a breach when you can show with some degree of certainty, maybe not full evidence, but with some degree of certainty that that incident, right? Somebody got in, it's an incident. Somebody got in and got to your database servers, it's an incident. Got to the database server that had PII on it, it's now a breach. Whether any was actually taken off of that or not, in my opinion, you're now talking about a potential breach because it's been accessed. Do you know whether it's been pulled out or not? My opinion is you can still call it an incident, but internally you should call it a breach until you can demonstrate with evidence that no PII has been taken. It's a slippery slope, you're right. Your lawyers will tell you, yes, and the cloud service providers' lawyers will tell you it's not a breach yet because we can't, with some degree of certainty prove that it's, with evidence in that incident. They'll say we need evidence to demonstrate that it's actually been a breach and information has been extracted. What I would say is you'd want to have disclosure around incidents as well. So that's what I ask for, is if you guys have incidents, I just want an incident disclosure report. That's all. I may get it, I may not get it. Surprisingly, 70% of the time I got it. So, am I okay? I think I have one more? Thank you.
What's your opinion of a situation where the company say, well, we offer 99% uptime?
Yeah.
So here's the picture. 99% of the uptime in 365 days is 8,760 hours. So 1% of that is 87.6 hours.
Yeah.
Which is 3.65 days. What does that measure? You're saying you be down to 3 days before you're in breach.
Yeah, that's so there's two.
It sounds like a good number when you say 99.
Yeah, that's a liability thing too, right? So nobody can guarantee 100% uptime, right? I remember early days, the talks about 5 nines. 5 nines cost more than 4 nines, and definitely cost more than 3 nines. I think that's a conversation mostly around uptime and availability, with no statements around what the availability and accessibility means to you from a security and risk perspective. It's only viewed in the light of accessibility and availability. You know what I'm saying? They're measuring it from accessibility and availability, not from a control of, without accessibility, the risk to my organization is $1 million because if my website's down for 3 days and we do $750,000 in transaction every 3 days, that's when you can look at financial penalties. And I've seen a lot of organizations negotiate financial penalties into their contracts as a result. When I was working for a telco, I had financial penalties built into my contracts for customers when they had downtime. We paid them back money for the downtime because some of their financial systems relied on it. And so our contracts actually reflected financial penalties as a result of it. These were very savvy customers that said, our risk is tied to that accessibility, therefore we want financial penalties built into it. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to have a conversation around accessibility and availability versus risk. And I think you can change the conversation to risk by saying, well, this costs us money, and that's a risk to our organization, so therefore we need to have contingencies, which would then be financial penalties, right? There's lots of different ways of looking at it too, right? But, yeah. Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, everyone.